Perfectionism is the fear of inadequacy disguised as the pursuit of excellence. That is perfectionism. Perfectionism is the fact that you and I might think that we have all of it together, but we absolutely are gutted by the fear of failure, and it describes all our behaviors, whether at work or at home. But today's podcast is trying to tie the gap between that specific behavior and an African champion.
Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent.
This is Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso, a revolutionary leader for which the last 30 to 40 years has represented what Africa needs, what Africa wants, and what Africa is trying to pursue, which is a state for which high standards are held, people are held to account, and the highest degree of success is deemed the only plausible solution as an outcome. So if this is for you, if this resonates with you, if perfectionism is something that you struggle with, welcome to another episode of MoloMolo African Tech Stories, where we share the news and stories of African tech champions that are shaping the future of the African continent. So, was Thomas Sankara a perfectionist from Burkina Faso? Was he the one who essentially brought about the term within an African context? This and many more is some of the questions we have on today's show. If this is for you, stay tuned as we will talk about some reflective questions that you and I might have, whether at work or at home, and essentially seeing how we can work on this specific issue that, in my view, can really improve our day-to-day, but also improve our trajectory in terms of technology and also our career potential. So we are talking about perfectionism today. We are talking about how perfectionism is essentially something that consistently kills us in our thoughts, gives us sometimes nightmares, causes us to think about, man, how do I get out of it? What should I do? Why do I have these negative thoughts? Why do I procrastinate at work? Why am I tagging the outcome of a task to the worth that I feel? And that's essentially something that, in my view, we need to speak about. In my view, we need to decide how we're going to handle it. Because essentially, from a career perspective, within the technology and outside of it, perfectionism is something that, if not well maintained and if not well understood, can break and completely derail your career as an entrepreneur or as a technology professional. So let's look at some facts, okay? Let's try and understand how this affects the day-to-day lives of those who are working within the technology space. Essentially, perfectionism from studies that show that 30% of workers admit that perfection leads them to procrastinate on tasks. Another study has shown that ultimately 52% of tech employees report feeling exhausted by perfectionist-driven expectation, i.e., wanting to feel exhausted by a sense of being perfectionist or the expectation that comes from needing to always be perfect. A separate study, specifically in the School of London, has shown that 20% of high achievers in tech industry experience anxiety from perfectionism. So perfectionism is a problem. Perfectionism is something that we should all be thinking about. Perfectionism is something that we should all well understand within our own lives and within something that we need to deal with, essentially. I mean, I think I'm a perfectionist in many ways. I do think that there is good and bad when it comes to perfectionism, But essentially, I also do think it's something that we need to be well aware of when it comes to how our attitude towards changing and the career that we want to build. So, speaking about perfectionism in the workplace, we have decided to gear up a technical coaching program called Technical Coaching for Individuals and Technical Professionals and Entrepreneurs within the scope of a very famous book, Who Moved My Cheese. It's a 3 month program where you'll get one on one support, weekly sessions with me, and ultimately going through some of these things that manifest themselves within the workplace. Essentially, a perfectionist nature that really causes a lot of negative behaviors in the workplace when it comes to either procrastination or lack of delegation or even just incredible abrasive nature when it comes to high standards vis-a-vis other individuals. So this is a coaching program. If you're interested in it, there will be details in the description below wherever you're watching this video, so that you're able to contact the MoloMolo Tech Studios and essentially book an assessment, that essentially 20 questions that you will have to fill out. And after that, you'll be getting a freebie, a kind of a checklist that should be able to help you to already answer some of these questions completely free of charge, of course. And essentially with that, you will be, once you're ready, you will be able to get a one-on-one sessions with me, the first session being free, so that we are able to align already some of your expectation when it comes to improving some of these behaviors that manifest itself in the workplace. Okay, so that's essentially what this is about. So let's try and get into kind of today's show, right? There are some self-reflective questions that I believe are worth talking about. So the first one is, what are your core beliefs when it comes to success and failure? What are your core beliefs when it comes to you feeling a sense of success, but also a sense of failure? What is it that you believe regarding those two, and how does that guide your behavior? Second one is, do you associate your self worth with your achievements? Do you associate your self worth with your achievements? This is also quite important because achievements will come, right? Those of you who are in the technology space, you're hired for a reason. You got really high standards, but is your self-worth directly attached to those specific achievements? And number three, where I think is also quite important, is what is your reaction when you don't meet your own high standards? How do you react? How do you ensure that you have the correct behavior? How do you ensure that the people around you see the correct behavior when those high standards are not met? And last but not least, we also have a specific one, which is, how do you approach collaboration and delegation in your work? What does that mean for you? How do you see it? What do you want from it? Are you even able to collaborate? Right? Some people are just completely unable to delegate and give over their work to other people and consistently micromanage. That is a sign of someone who might be struggling with the negative part of being a perfectionist. Okay, so those are quite important questions that I do think will help us. So let's get into the African champion, right? So when we think about those self-reflective questions, when we think about what does that mean, when we think about, what do we want to do about it, we need to kind of get a bit of context. I mean, this is MoloMolo after all, right? So this is the first podcast out of, if you're still kind of following us quite well, and I want to thank you so much for everyone who's been following us through the changes that we've been making. MoloMolo has now gone from just a podcast to essentially a plethora of services when it comes to one-on-one coaching, or whether it is e-learning, or whether it is this specific show that we do every single week, Marula Bites, that we bring different news that are affecting the lives of Africans. But it's all under the umbrella of wanting to inspire, wanting to help, wanting to improve, wanting to enhance the ability of tech professionals and entrepreneurs that have an affiliation for Africa or their own community to improve, to grow, and to be more than themselves and to really reach their true potential. So with that said, let's look at Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara is an amazing revolutionary in the 1970s and 1980s that essentially brought about an amazing change in the country of Burkina Faso. He's actually, although he was one of the few people, he's not just the only one, but he's the one who actually proposed the name of Burkina Faso after independence. He had amazing progressive policies. He essentially wanted to change healthcare. He was a lover of tech, from low tech all the way to high tech. When it comes to medical centers, he had different policies on immigration, on gender equality. Even in the 1970s, 1980s, he already proclaimed Pan-Africanism when it comes to women and women respect, specifically women and children. He was known as an environmentalist, whereby he fought the desertification of the Sahel region, which essentially is the south of the Sahara Desert, essentially trying to plant at the time 10 million trees, which was unheard of. This is 1980s Burkina Faso, where he managed to ensure that at least these trees were planted. Until today is deemed as a success story when it comes to fighting desertification of the Sahel region. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1987. Until today, including his predecessor, or successor, should I say, Ibrahim Traore, which essentially is see him, Thomas Sankara, as a beacon of reference when it comes to someone who had high standards when it comes to just wanting his countries to change. And that for me is quite an amazing thing to think about. So when we think about Thomas Sankara, we think about a couple of things. Let's think about this, right? Thomas Sankara was all about anti corruption, he was all about self sufficiency. He was a no compromise person. But with that came brutal punishment. There are documented stories of his courts of reformation, of his battles against anti-corruption pre-colonial leaders, and those were brutal. He imprisoned a lot of opposition leaders, and he essentially killed at some point, or ordered the assassination of a couple of high-profile politicians that were against his strong regiment when it came to changing the country narratives for the high standards that he has set for himself and his government. So the question begs, was Thomas Sankara a perfectionist? Was he someone who had unrelenting high standards to the point of that being a detrimental downfall to him? What can we learn from that? What can we learn from ensuring that we are not doing the same? We are not essentially seeing the same thing. And that for me is quite important, because if we're not careful, we just repeat history. If you're not careful, for the pursuit of high standards, for things to change, for things to be better, for things to be, kind of moving forward, we could also have an unrelenting attitude towards mistakes that is detrimental to the overall progress of either for us or for our team. So it is quite important that we get into the understanding of what perfectionism is. So, what is perfectionism? Perfectionism is the fear of inadequacy disguised as a pursuit of excellence. This is quite important. The fear of inadequacy is the fear of not knowing, it's the fear of not pursuing, it is the fear of not wanting, to look anything beyond the image that you've set for yourself. You want to look the part. I mean, this is the character Fear in Inside Out. I mean, I love cartoons. I love watching them. I enjoy it. I absolutely enjoy cartoons, and and it's quite important for all of us to understand that fear is a big part of us, of what we do. Fear, the fear of failure, the fear of not looking the part, the fear of wanting to always uh, put your best foot forward, the fear of other people's failures, kind of transferred fear, right? Transferred failure, should I say, and the fear of that. The fear of, and essentially this applies to Africans, because if you're an African or you grew up in Africa, you know of someone, either in your family or someone close to it, who has failed, who has who's down and out, who's bottomed out, who has only but problems to communicate. And that fear of not wanting to be that person, that aunt, that uncle, that grandfather or grandmother, brings a certain level of inadequacy, as if we do not belong. So, perfectionism is essentially part of the next few series, which will be on the series within the imposter syndrome set of series. And and perfectionism is essentially saying that I do not believe, a perfectionist is essentially saying, I do not believe that I'm worthy. I do not believe that I can do it, but I will disguise myself through working hard, through being uncompromising, through always having high standards. But unfortunately, it could come to the cost of relationships. It could come to the cost of not really seeing that you can be without it, that it's okay to fail. And we will get into kind of the fixed and growth mindset that goes with it. But essentially, that's what it is. It is a contrast of you looking the part externally, while internally you are completely and utterly fearful of if people were to see you for who you are, quote unquote. So this is essentially what perfectionism is, and all of us in some way or form are perfectionists within certain contexts that, in my view, we always need to be aware of. What does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? I think that it is something that we need to always be careful. Perfectionism erodes your self-worth. You and I are blessed. If you are able to watch this, wherever you're watching it, on your phone, or you're hearing this on a podcast with, I don't know, I guess MoloMolo African Tech Stories is pretty much everywhere. And again, thank you so much for everyone who's been watching and listening to the MoloMolo African Tech Stories. But if you're watching this and you have an account on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or now I guess it's YouTube Music, I can't remember what it is exactly, that has podcasts also, since Google Podcast is now no more. If you're watching this, you are privileged, which means that some other you or someone else allowed you and helped you to get to this stage. A lot of people are not at that stage. A lot of people do not have a very good career. Don't even know what a career even means, right? I mean, I do think that when you think about career, one thing is you should think about is that you were qualified to even get into one, right? And that on its own is a privilege versus a job, versus kind of a McDonald's, serving fries is not necessarily a career that everybody wants to take upon. Of course, it can get into one once you find clarity on which direction. But that's a job. A career is really something that you've really put a lot of effort in having a trajectory that will allow you to grow and find and grow your potential within a specific line of industry and so forth. So we are privileged, and we should remember that. And I do think that our worth should never be based on outcomes of the things that we do. Our worth is all around us. Our worth, for those who are Christians, our worth is in what God sees in us, what God believes we can do, what God believes we can be. We can be a good father, we can be a good husband, we can be a good son, a good friend, and we can help other people be the same. So spiritually speaking, our worth comes from seeing how God views us and believing and having faith that that's who we are worth to him. But beyond that scope, our worth is really all around the things that, or the people that are around you and their view of you. Your metric of your worth should be directly proportional to the person who loves you the most. That is your worth. Let me repeat that. Your metric of your worth should be directly measured or directly proportional to the person who loves you the most. That is your worth. That is my worth. So perfectionism, or bad perfectionism, as they call it, because there's good and bad, really erodes that. Really causes it to really wear down, because you directly attach your worth to outcomes that might be good or bad. That is not your worth. That is not my worth. How can it be? But unfortunately, we live in a society where outcome based, and what we see is what we value. And what we value, we think that's what people are worth, good or bad, high or low. But that is not the truth. That is not the truth, and that is a lie. So, my point here is that your worth is directly proportional to the person who loves you the most. Whether it is your mom, whether it is your wife, whether it is your child, whether whether it is your grandfather, or whether it is the love that you feel that God has for you based on the scriptures that you read. That, or based on the Quran, or based on the Bible. And that for me is so important, because that gives a sense of freedom and a sense of confidence that I can go forward, that I can try again, that I can venture out, and that I can be better. And with that brings a certain level of mindset change. So let's talk about something else, right? Because that's also quite important. Now, with the same light, it should be important to focus on growth rather than perfection. So these are all kind of things that I've been thinking about, because if you don't focus on growth but rather focus, in this case, if you look at this plant, right, this plant looks crooked. I mean, I don't know which of you looked at this plant and be like, why is the stem not straight? But the focus should be, man, this plant, despite its crookedness, has managed to blossom. What does that mean for us? It means, as a tech professional, as a tech enthusiast, as a tech entrepreneur, and just as a person in general, our focus should not be on the end result, being perfect. Our focus should be on the journey. Should be the fact that we are growing. In German we say Schritt für Schritt, which means step by step we are growing. You and I are no longer the same as we were 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last month. There is a sense of growth, and you need to look for those positives, and you need to reinforce those positives as part of your mindset. Why? Because the focus should be on growing. Despite the current result, the focus should be on growth. And so that's my encouragement to you and me, is that we need to focus on growth. Results do matter. Don't get me wrong. Results do matter. Okay? Now, if you were to have the same result over and over again, you got to fix something. You got to change it. But results do not make up who you are. If you are no results, no mistakes, man, you are really, really poor in terms of just overall quality of life, because your life is diminished to just being a no mistakes person. So when it comes to having a mindset of dealing with perfectionism, or at least the bad part of being a perfectionist, which essentially affects your behavior, we've got to understand that it is a battle. It is a battle that you and I face, and it's something that we need to consistently grow. And that is quite important for all of us to understand, but also quite important for all of us to see how we can overcome it and move forward.
Research by psychologists Paulin, Israeli, and Anthony suggests that perfectionism comes in two forms: adaptive and maladaptive, positive and negative perfectionism. Perfectionists normally display a combination of both adaptive and maladaptive thoughts and behaviours. And until now, one of the most popular ways to manage perfectionism has been to encourage the recalibration of standards, to promote the thought that perfection doesn't exist, and so we should embrace excellence as a more realistic and healthier target. Perfectionists hate the word excellence. It's like you're sending us out to win bronze at the Olympics.
Now, so what this person, this is a TED talk that happened a couple of years ago, and really tries to kind of, unpack what perfectionist should be and how to deal with kind of the maladaptive side of perfectionism. Perfectionism is not excellence, number one. So we are not talking about just try your best, right? We are talking about having incredible high standards for yourself, incredible high standards for your family, incredible high standards for your career, and trying to achieve that. The question is, what does that mean in terms of your internal feelings when it comes to success or failure if you do not achieve, or even if you do achieve it? What are those feelings, and at what cost are you willing to have those achieved? And so what this video is trying to essentially bring about is that perfectionism is not excellence, right? Okay, so we're not talking about just doing your best and just trying your best. And this is something that we tell kids, right? We tell kids, which is important because they don't have a regulatory understanding of the kind of the social aspect or the psychological aspect that perfectionist bad behavior can do. So we try to steer with them just to consistently have fun. But in a career where your life, or should I say your career, is on the line, having no mistakes is almost a no-brainer. But one thing that we need to consistently understand is that, as I've shown in a couple of slides before, is that we cannot allow that no mistakes attitude to affect who we think or what we think we are worth. And that's quite important for us to understand. So perfectionist is really something that it's a fine balance, essentially, a fine balance of the internal fear and how it is overpowering our behavior when it comes to our understanding of the standards that we would like to achieve. So and this is quite important.
The introduction of self-compassion in our pursuit of perfection is a game changer. It allows us to be the best we can be in healthy ways with no compromise to the standards that we hold. It not only enables us to reduce our experiences with maladaptive perfectionism and depression, it actually makes us more productive. When we're compassionate, the parasympathetic nervous system, the part that calms us down, switches on, which leads to higher creativity. More blood flows to the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that does most of our thinking, and a hormone called oxytocin flows more freely, enabling us to better manage our levels of stress.
So what is he saying? He's saying that essentially when it comes to dealing with perfectionism, is that we need to be able to understand that compassion, when it comes to self-doubt or self-worth, is a direct weapon against those negative thoughts. When it comes to having empathy, not towards just others, and we will go into kind of empathy itself, but also towards yourself, is that is a direct mechanism, a direct tool to help you and I deal with our negative thoughts, deal with our negative perception, deal with our fear of inadequacy, deal with our fear of failure. And compassion not only directly deals with our negative thoughts, but helps us to focus on the real benefit of being a perfectionist, which is consistently planning for higher and higher things for yourself and for your family, consistently planning to want to do better, to want to work harder, but without having the negative baggage, the negative chains that consistently brings you down and essentially confirms that because you have failed, you are not worth it. And because you're not worth it, you will consistently fail. That compassion breaks that chain, breaks that consistent negative pattern. And that is the key. That is very key when it comes to compassion. Now, what does that mean? And that's something that's quite important. What does that mean? Because empathy empathy is essentially where it all resides in. The ability for you to be empathetic. What does that even empathetic means? The empathy essentially means your ability to see other people's viewpoint, to kind of put yourself in their shoes, right? That's essentially what empathy means. To kind of ask your question, if I was them, will I behave the same way? If I was them, will I be able to see it the same way? And that's quite important because that directly helps with delegation at work. If I'm going to ask someone to do something, where are they at, kind of mindset wise? Where are they at when it comes to knowledge wise? What is this? What are the things that I can do or should be thinking about to ensure that they have the best chance of performing the specific task? That's empathy. But more importantly, if I understand that, how can I position myself such that my negative thoughts, such that the thought of inadequacy is not projected onto them? That's where compassion and empathy becomes a game changer. Because all of a sudden your focus is on solution and not distractions and not walls and not harsh talks and not distance. But it's kind of collaborative now. You are glued in instead of pushed apart because your compassion and empathy now brings people together and not pushes them away due to your negative thoughts. This is a game changer for me because I do believe that my ability to have empathy, even if it comes from a Christian background, but essentially in a technical workspace, you don't share scriptures with everybody, right? You don't go around and share scriptures. So it's very important to understand what empathy means from a psychological perspective because that directly brings a sense of belonging and a sense of collaboration with different levels of seniority within your workplace, whether it is from a junior level and seeing them as a peer or all the way to CTO and above and seeing them as a peer and how you can engage and have the same level of empathy when it comes to their situation vis-a-vis yours. That is a game changer when it comes and more importantly, without you compromising your high standards. So it's got nothing to do with compromise. It's got to do with turning the negative aspect and replacing it with positive energy towards others and yourself. So in closing, I do think that this is quite important that we close with this. So there is a school of thoughts when it comes to growth mindset and fixed mindset. Growth mindset deals with you seeing life as fluid, you seeing life as something that is to be experienced, to be that is consistently changing, and that's essentially why our coaching program is really geared towards this best-selling book called Who Moved My Cheese, right? It's all about embracing change and embracing that life will change, and so we need to grow and adapt and feel that we need to consistently see the beauty essentially of change. And that is the difference between growth and fix, where fix is rigid and it has its purpose, but it's the over compulsive nature of being rigid that is a problem. So, for example, a growth mindset will see mistakes as something that allows you to learn, versus a fixed mindset at all costs would see, I don't want to make mistakes at all. And your behavior is dictated by that belief system that essentially shuts people out because you want to do everything yourself. Because have you heard the phrase, and I'm sure you've heard the phrase like, okay, if you want to do it right, do it yourself. Yes, in part true, but it also could imply that if you consistently do that, uncompromisingly so, you consistently alienate and essentially you fall on your sword, so to speak, by that set of values. And it goes on where it talks about feedback, I think, and I think those who are listening to this, so growth mindset, talks about mistakes that helps you learn, talks about feedback being valuable, and that just kind of evaluating how your work can get better and better. Kind of talk about improvement through iteration and through practice, and you kind of trial and error, and you really just see the need to learn and to grow and to observe and to feel and to change and to adapt, and the resilience that goes with all of that. That is a growth mindset, to say I will keep on going, I will keep on trying, and I know that I will get there one day. Versus a fixed mindset, which says, like I mentioned, you are stuck in your ways of just making sure that there is no mistakes, but you also have a negative sense of self-worth because you feel like you're not good enough, i.e. you project a sense of no mistakes. You feel like I am the best or I am the worst, and also I'm not good enough, and I need to give up because I will not get it done. And so a perfectionist, in many ways, from a wrong side or a fixed mindset perspective, essentially could also be a non-starter, like we saw before in terms of stats. You procrastinate because you feel like you're not good enough, because your view of your self-worth is stuck on logic 0 and 1s, which is either I do it with no mistakes or I don't do it at all. And that's essentially a non-starter. And if you don't start, you will never progress and you'll never learn. So that is perfectionism. I hope you and I've definitely learned something today. I've been studying it out, and this is essentially part one of not many, but at least part one of at least 4 different aspects of imposter syndrome that we will be looking at as part of the podcast series on imposter syndrome. And I would like to know what you think. I'd like to know, in the comments below, or send us an email. Let us know what you think about being a perfectionist. Let us know how you feel about it. And essentially, this is quite important because we need to change the narrative for ourselves, for our family, for our friends. And once we start identifying the specific issues, we're able to deal with them. We're able to point them out in a gentle way, with empathy, right? Remember, empathy, with compassion. And with that, see that even though, if we go back to the story of Thomas Sankara, even though you had the best intentions, even though you have incredibly high standards of changing things, you've got to have compassion. You got to have an ability to see yourself, even from an enemy perspective. You got to be able to see kind of why did they do what they did, and react accordingly. For me, that's quite important. And so I encourage you to kind of reflect on this, see how we can kind of change the narrative on our day-to-day when it comes to dealing with our own view of what it means to be a perfectionist, but also seeing opportunities of being compassionate with ourselves, compassionate, not necessarily mediocre, because that's very important. We still want high standards. We still want to achieve, but we need to, when there's failure, specifically when there's failure, we need to be able to see how we can resolve it. Thank you again for listening, and thank you for watching for another episode of MoloMolo African Tech Stories, where we share the news and we share incredible stories of African tech champions and innovators that are shaping the future of the African continent. I'm Dr. Paulin Kantue. Thank you for watching. Until next time. Ciao.